You're listening to Learning is the New Working, a podcast by the Learning Futures Group about the future of workplace learning and the people helping define it. Welcome to the 5th episode in our Is Purpose Working season, a collaboration with Red Thread Research in which we talk to influential talent and learning leaders, thinkers and academics who work in or think about purpose-driven organizations and the impact on all aspects of talent management. We're very grateful for the team at NovoEd for their sponsorship of this season. Global enterprises rely on NovoEd's collaborative online learning platform to build high-value capabilities that result in real impact. With NovoEd, you deliver powerful, engaging learning that activates deep skill development and drives measurable business outcomes. NovoEd will host a live webinar later in the season where Danny, Stacia and I will reflect on what we've learned, the implications for you as learning and talent teams, and take your questions and comments live. To reserve your seat, to get your questions in, and find other bonus materials, please register now at www.novoed.com/purpose. We're about halfway through our season, and there's lots going on in the world relating to the topic of talent and purpose. So we have a 2-part episode for you this time. In the second half of the hour, Danny, Stacia and I will discuss a couple of recently released reports and some public statements that have a material bearing on our topic. But we're going to start the episode with a conversation that Danny and I had with Dan Pontefract. Dan is a leadership strategist, author, keynote speaker, and his bestsellers include Lead, Care, Win, How to Become a Leader Who Matters, Open to Think, The Purpose Effect, and Flat Army. Great title for a book. Dan was Chief Envisioner and Chief Learning Officer at TELUS, a Canadian telecommunications company with revenues in excess of $14 billion and over 50,000 worldwide employees. He launched the Transformation Office, the TELUS MBA program, and the TELUS Leadership Philosophy, all initiatives that drastically helped to increase the company's employee engagement. We started as usual with our set of questions designed to help sketch out Dan's work and career.
Dan Pontefract, founder of the Pontefract Group, author, speaker, leadership strategist, based in Victoria, British Columbia, Canada, and today is the 19th of October, 2020 Vision. Well, I'm in the capital city of one of Canada's 10 provinces, British Columbia, that city, Victoria, named, yes, after the Queen. Moved here about 8 years ago from Vancouver, where I spent 17 years in Vancouver. And prior to that, I grew up a bit in Ontario and Quebec in Canada, born in England, Blackburn, Lancashire. I am a leadership strategist, I like to refer to myself as, which is someone who's trying to help people, teams, organizations become better versions of themselves, which revolves around a 3-legged stool. One of those legs is purpose, another leg is culture, another leg is how we think. And what unites it all, the seat, is this thing called leadership. I thought I was going to be a doctor, and then I realized that I didn't like blood, so that was bad. I dropped out, or I guess I switched out of pre-med at McGill University in Montreal and switched into the Bachelor's of Education and Bachelor's of Arts program. So I thought I was going to be a teacher. I lasted 2 years teaching high school, of which then I morphed my way into higher ed, spent about 6 years at the Institute of British Columbia, and then the corporate world beckoned. And between 2002, 2018, between SAP and TELUS, so a high-tech company and a telecom, I was both a chief learning officer and something we call the chief envisioner, which was a totally made-up word to freak the press out.
You have written 4 books. Is there a sort of core underlying thing that ties these ideas together?
Indeed. The way I looked at it, and there's a 5th one in the works, incidentally, is that book 1 was taking a look at culture. Like, what is corporate culture? What is, organizational culture? How does it manifest? How does it suck? What's the link to employee engagement, if you will? And then I recognized there was no plan really to write another book, but I thought, well, there's something missing to culture. And that was the yin to the yang. And that's where I stumbled upon back in 2014, this notion of purpose. And so I wrote a book based on kind of an investigation into some organizations and just my own thoughts really about what we were doing at TELUS at the time, which is a $50,000, $14 billion telecom, about how we might serve others, basically was the premise. So book 2 was the yin to the yang with culture. So Flat Army being the book was culture. The Purpose Effect was about purpose. But then the epiphany also rang true such that I recognized, well, we're not doing a very good job on culture change, and certainly no one's, deploying a sense of purpose or higher meaning. What's wrong? And so effectively, I narrowed it down to one of several ailments, and that was the way in which we think. And Open to Think, the third book, was me waxing lyrical, if you will, on how we've lost sight of marinating in the moment, Chris and Danny, how we don't creatively or critically think, and how we're just addicted to busyness and distraction and social media and, overburdened calendars. So it became a bit of an antidote and recipe for, well, if we want culture change to happen, if we want purpose to happen, maybe we need to take a look at our thinking. So that happened. That came out in 2018. And then I immediately went into work on book 4 as soon as Open to Think published, incidentally, because I wanted to create, if you will, a book that was a field guide about leadership. And the first 3 books were traditional hardcover, 85,000 word books with tons of interviews, tons of research, and, thick, cerebral even. But I wanted something to be paperback, 35,000 words, and just sort of chock full of techniques and lessons on how to become what I call a leader who matters, which does pay homage to culture and does pay homage to purpose and does pay homage to thinking. But there's some other bits in there that ultimately help the user and the learner and the reader become a better leader.
What kind of work are you doing today, Dan?
I left TELUS, the aforementioned telecom, full-time on January 1st, 2019, and went out on my own. I went on my own and started the Pontefract Group, which is, in Paul Jarvis's language, a company of one. I'm out there helping organizations and or individuals whom are interested in, how their organization operates. If they want it to be a little more transparent, open, collaborative, if they're thinking about, this fad, Chris and Danny, called purpose, what do we do here? And again, so based on the books, I'll do talks, I'll do consulting, I've done organizational redesign, typical CHRO, CLO, experience officer type stuff to help others.
So I'm super interested in, was Purpose Effect your first book or your second book?
It was book number 2.
I'm fascinated with we are fascinated with the idea of purpose, and I'm really interested in what sort of prompted you to write that.
It really, as I kind of began to, dig into the work of Roger L. Martin and the work of Charles Handy and the work of Clayton Christensen and just the greats before us, it really struck me as a practitioner inside an organization of how culture is supposed to be working, that we were missing out on something at TELUS. And so don't forget, as its chief learning officer, I was helping to create back in 2008, 2009, 2010, this something called the TELUS leadership philosophy. And the TLP, as we affectionately called it, was our North Star. It wasn't just, values on a wall. It was a working, operating behavior guide for how we were supposed to interact with each other. But the first thing that we did was we defined our target audience. Who are we leading? It took about a year and a bit to put the TLP together and to launch it into the organization in the summer of 2010. But one of the things, which we weren't calling it purpose at the time, incidentally, which we've now gone back and refined it as social purpose, nonetheless, we were very clear from the get-go in the TLP that we would affect our leadership toward 4 key audiences. And the 4 audiences that we ended up defining as part of the TLP were as follows. Obviously customers. So our customers we serve, our team members, the business. So that would be those due a fair return from a financial means perspective. So shareholders, investors, etc., and community. That became the launch pad for me because as an organization, we said, no, community is the word we're going to use, and that's how we're going to serve. And what landed on me was, well, actually, that's the who. That's who we're serving. How do we do it? The how was where the word purpose came in. And so then I started trying to figure out, well, what is purpose? And that's where I then found that there's actually 3 types of purpose, which if you want to go into that, I'm happy to.
How did you guys land on purpose? I mean, in a world where everybody really is focused on, shareholder value and profits, how did you sort of wrap your organization around the idea of purpose?
Shareholder return, and to a degree EBITDA, are actually outcomes of what you stand for and how you operate as an organization. We know that on a global basis, we're still stuck at 87-ish% of the world disengaged or not engaged at work. But there's a correlation as well when you kind of dig down to the next layer of the causal relationship between culture or engagement and purpose. When the organization feels as though its intent, its belief, its actions are indeed working for a higher purpose, i.e. community, i.e. others, not just EBITDA, shareholder return, etc., then what happens is it triggers a sense of engagement and community itself in the organization. I don't know if Danny, actually knew what we were doing back in 2010 through 2013, 2014. But we knew enough to say back then, there's more to us than just shareholder return.
The nature of the work that TELUS does, connecting people, do you think that had anything to do with how you got to like community in particular, but purpose?
I think that's a fair query, Chris. To be honest, it was the organization, was a public crown corp up until 1999 and very unionized shop. But at the end of the day, TELUS itself, circa 2001, became a publicly traded organization, and the machinations that go along with becoming publicly traded were usurped any sort of Crown Corp ethos that was originally lingering, if you will, because it's the notion of an organization's singular mandate. For many, if not all, publicly traded organizations, other than maybe Unilever back in 2010, was what? It's to serve the stock market and the analysts every quarter. I have an example, and it's a large company that everybody knows and most people use. And the situation is circa middle of April 2020, and there are some whistleblowers at everyone's favorite online shopping mall, Amazon, that are discussing work conditions in the factories, in the warehouses. And there's a VP of cloud computing. His name is Tim Bray. And Tim Bray, albeit Canadian, working out of Vancouver, goes through the regular channels inside of Amazon, right, to highlight his disdain for how these whistleblowers are being fired for complaining about the lack of safety in the warehouse. And so because he's a VP, and he says this on a public blog post, said, I wanted to follow the right protocol and the right chain of command. By being then and subsequently ignored and shushed, Tim was left with a decision. He looked at his sense of self, meaning purpose. What does the organization stand for? And what's my role in all this? Which is just very simply the 3 types of purpose that I believe are found in all of us and must intersect. And when they're not in lockstep, either we have to make a decision or we have to live with it. And Tim Bray made a decision. He quit publicly in a blog post outing, the situation that just had unfolded and saying, look, this is not my values. This is not essentially my purpose. And so I'm out. And I think that's encapsulates for many, just as a microcosmic story, what goes on. It's that organizations might say, and again, this is not an Amazon example now, but organizations might say they operate with a great sense of purpose. That's the what. But the how, the behaviors, do they actually serve community? Do they actually serve all stakeholders and not just shareholders? That's what gets frightening.
Let's talk about those 3 things. You've mentioned them a couple of times now. In your book, you discuss 3 types of purpose. Personal purpose, which I think we just got a really good view of with Tim Bray. The second one is role purpose, and then organizational purpose. You talk about them in sort of three separate chunks, critical relationship between the three. So talk about